somewhere in the middle of the movie so that nobody can tell that you're getting your feet wet,
Right.
So to speak. And
Right.
just to start out with the love scenes in the first week is...
Diane Lane has spent over 4 decades playing women who fall hard, completely, sometimes destructively for men they probably shouldn't. She did it on screen with a conviction that made audiences genuinely uncomfortable with how much they believed it. And for almost as long as she's been doing that, the question has followed her off set and into every interview she's sat for. How much of that was acting? The rumors that attached themselves to her name, co-star after co-star, film after film, never fully went away. They just went quiet. Until she started, slowly and on her own terms, giving answers that nobody was quite prepared for. The film that started a decade of speculation. There are roles that follow an actor permanently. And then there's Unfaithful. When Diane Lane took on the lead in Adrian Lyne's 2002 film, she wasn't just playing a woman having an affair, she was playing it with a specificity and a physical abandon that left critics genuinely struggling to describe what they were watching. The performance earned her an Academy Award nomination and a Golden Globe win, and it also did something else entirely. It attached her name to a set of questions about where the performance ended and the person began that she spent the better part of the next decade navigating. Her co-star in Unfaithful was Olivier Martinez, a French actor whose screen presence in the film was almost entirely constructed around heat and danger. The scenes between them were not shot at a comfortable distance. Lyne, who had made his reputation on films like Fatal Attraction and Indecent Proposal, directed with a close attention to physical reality that left little room for clinical separation. And once the film was released, and audiences saw what Lane and Martinez had produced together, the speculation was essentially immediate. The rumors about Lane and Martinez extended well beyond what normally attaches itself to a film's promotional cycle. The chemistry on screen was so specific and so convincing that people who covered Hollywood for a living were writing about it with a certainty they usually reserved for confirmed stories. There were reports of a closeness on set that went beyond professional, suggestions that what the camera captured was drawing from something real, whispers from sources close to the production that the line between character and person had blurred in ways that don't typically happen on closed sets with professional crews. What makes the Unfaithful situation particularly complicated to untangle is the nature of what the film required. Lane's character spends the majority of the running time in the grip of something she can't explain and can't stop, and the performance required her to access and sustain that state across weeks of shooting. Lyne's films have always operated on the premise that actors need to genuinely feel the emotional truth of a scene rather than approximate it, and he has spoken across multiple interviews over the years about how he worked with his cast on Unfaithful to get the film to the emotional register he needed. That method of working doesn't disappear cleanly when the cameras stop rolling. Lane never confirmed the rumors. She also didn't dismiss them in the way that stars usually dismiss things they need the public to stop thinking about. The quick, flat denial designed to close a topic permanently. What she did instead was speak about the role with a depth and an intimacy that kept the conversation alive, acknowledging the genuine psychological complexity of what Unfaithful had required of her without giving a clear answer to the question the audience was actually asking. It was a careful and intelligent approach to a story she had no obligation to simplify. And it worked well enough that the speculation continued well past the film's theatrical run. By the time Unfaithful had completed its run, Diane Lane occupied a different position in the cultural conversation than she had before it. The role had reframed her entirely, from an actor with an interesting career and an underused talent to a specific kind of presence that Hollywood and its audiences found genuinely difficult to look away from. a private life in a very public industry. What makes Diane Lane's situation unusual in the context of Hollywood romance rumors is that her actual personal life has been genuinely dramatic, documented, confirmed, and in some cases publicly painful, in ways that should have been more than enough to satisfy anyone looking for a story. The speculation about co-stars existed alongside a real biographical record that was complicated enough to deserve attention in its own right. To understand any of it properly, you have to start earlier than most people do. Lane was not a regular child actor in the conventional sense. She was performing on professional stages in New York as a child, trained within a theatrical environment that treated her as a serious young talent rather than a novelty. By the time she appeared in George Roy Hill's A Little Romance at 13, she was already being described by critics as a natural. Francis Ford Coppola cast her in both The Outsiders and Rumblefish. When she was 17 and 18, and she was surrounded in both productions by young male actors Matt Dillon, Rob Lowe, Tom Cruise, Patrick Swayze, who were themselves at the beginning of what would become significant careers. She was a teenager on sets full of young men and professional attention and all the intensity that comes with both. And she navigated it in a way that left her intact professionally, even when it didn't leave her unmarked personally. Lane married the actor Christopher Lambert in 1988. She was 23. Lambert was 10 years older and was at the peak of his Highlander fame. The marriage lasted until 1994, and their daughter Eleanor was born in 1993. The divorce was quiet by Hollywood standards, but Lane later spoke in interviews about how hard that period had been and about how the dissolution of a marriage while simultaneously navigating a career and a new baby is not something that leaves you unchanged. The years between her divorce from Lambert and her next marriage were years in which she worked consistently and maintained an almost aggressively private personal life. She gave interviews, she promoted films, she appeared at industry events, and she declined almost entirely to discuss anything that was actually happening in her private world. That silence, in the entertainment press's particular logic, became its own kind of invitation. The less she said, the more people speculated, and the speculation tended to attach itself to whoever she was working with at any given moment. Then came Josh Brolin. Lane and Brolin married in August of 2004, and the courtship was brief enough to generate its own commentary. The marriage lasted 9 years before Lane filed for divorce in 2013. What leaked out during and after the separation was limited, but enough to sketch the shape of a relationship that had become something neither of them could sustain. There were reports of volatility. There was the particular silence that surrounds a divorce when both parties have lawyers who understand what public statements cost. Lane processed the end of her second marriage largely out of the public eye and emerged from it with the same insistence on privacy she had always maintained. The biographical record, 2 marriages, 2 divorces, a daughter, a career that spans 5 decades, is a genuinely full life. The fact that it never fully satisfied the audience's appetite says something about how that appetite works. Real complexity is harder to consume than rumor. Richard Gere and the film that wrote itself. If Unfaithful opened a decade of speculation, Nights in Rodanthe did something specific and targeted. It gave that speculation a very particular face. When Lane and Richard Gere were cast together in the 2008 adaptation of Nicholas Sparks's novel, it was not a neutral piece of casting. These were 2 people who had both, separately and in different ways, become associated in the public imagination with a certain kind of romantic intensity. Putting them together in a film built entirely around that intensity was always going to produce more than a box office result. Gere, by 2008, had been one of Hollywood's most reliably rumored romantic figures for nearly 3 decades. Lane came in with the unfaithful context still attached. The combination produced a promotional cycle that the studio leaned into deliberately. Interviews designed to surface the chemistry, press events that placed them together in settings constructed for maximum visual suggestion, a campaign built around the audience's existing investment in both of them as romantic presences. And then there was what actually happened on camera. Lane and Gere produced something on screen that felt genuinely lived in. The specific and slightly bruised quality of two people in middle age who have been through enough to know what they're risking when they open themselves to someone new. It landed with audiences in the way those films do when the central performances are carrying real weight rather than approximating it. The rumors that followed the film's release had a different texture than the unfaithful rumors. Those had been about heat and transgression. The Nights in Rodanthe speculation was quieter and in some ways more persistent. The suggestion that what Lane and Gere had found on screen had continued off it, that the warmth between them in interviews was something more than professionalism, that two people who had both been through the particular difficulty of public relationships had found something genuine in each other. Lane addressed the Gere rumors in the oblique way she had developed over years of practice, neither confirming nor dismissing, but speaking about him with a real affection and a real specificity that made the question feel less important than the friendship it was describing. They had made something together that she was proud of. The relationship between them was clearly real, and she was not going to be pressed further than that. The answer, delivered with a complete absence of defensiveness, was more effective than any denial would have been. The pattern. The press never stopped writing. By the time Diane Lane was in her 50s, a discernible pattern had established itself in how she was covered. And understanding that pattern is important to understanding what she eventually chose to address publicly. And why? The entertainment press had spent decades constructing a version of Diane Lane in which her on-screen intensity was understood as biographical evidence. The logic went, she plays these roles too convincingly for the passion to be purely technical. Therefore, the passion is real. Therefore, whoever she's playing it with is a candidate for the real thing. It was a narrative that served the press well because it was unfalsifiable. Every denial could be reread as confirmation. Every ambiguous statement could be interpreted in whichever direction produced the better story. Part of what sustained this narrative was the sheer consistency of what Lane produced on screen across different directors, different formats, and different decades. A Walk on the Moon, released in 1999, had placed her opposite Viggo Mortensen in a role that required a similar emotional register. A woman in a marriage that has calcified, finding something alive outside of it. And she delivered it with the same uncomfortable specificity. Under the Tuscan Sun in 2003 gave her a different kind of role, lighter and more searching. But even there, the audience's hunger to know how much of the warmth was real was visible in how the film was discussed. The pattern across her filmography was consistent enough that the press had essentially built a standing theory about her, one that got recycled and updated with each new project. What that narrative required Lane to do was effectively impossible. To shut it down permanently, she would have had to speak with a bluntness contrary to her entire approach to public life. That is not who Diane Lane has ever been, and she has said as much in enough different ways over the years. Her private life is hers, and the fact that she has chosen a public profession does not constitute an agreement to make all of herself public. But here's what actually changed as she moved into her 60s. She began speaking about the whole apparatus with a candor that was new. Not about the specific rumors, about the structure behind them. She spoke in interviews about how the industry's relationship with women changes around a certain age, how the romantic intensity that had generated decades of speculation gradually stopped being a subject of interest to the press, and how the liberation of that shift was more complicated than she had expected, carrying its own particular flavor of invisibility, along with the freedom from scrutiny. She talked about the experience of playing passion professionally across 4 decades, what it requires technically, what it asks of you personally, how the ability to access genuine emotional truth on screen does and does not relate to what's happening in your actual life. And she said something that reframed the entire preceding conversation, that the rumors had always said more about the audience's relationship with what she did on screen than they did about her own life. That when people watched Unfaithful and concluded that Diane Lane must be having an affair with her co-star, they were really responding to something the film had made them feel and attaching it to the nearest available real person. She wasn't angry about it. She understood it. She just didn't think it was actually about her. What she finally said and what it actually means. There's a version of this story that ends with a dramatic revelation, a confession, a confirmation, a clean answer to the question that followed Diane Lane for 20 years. That's not what happened. What happened is more interesting than that, and in some ways harder to process. Lane reached her 60s, having done something that very few actors of her generation managed. She got more interesting to watch, not less. The roles she was taking, in films and in the Netflix productions, that gave her a second wave of attention with a younger audience, and the result was a presence on screen that had a specific gravity that her earlier work, as good as it was, simply didn't have access to. She was 61, and she was better than she had ever been, and she knew it, and it showed. The interviews she gave during this period were the most open she had ever been in public, not because she had abandoned her commitment to privacy, but because she had reached a point where the distance between her public and private self felt less like protection and more like performance. And she was done performing distance. She talked about loneliness in the years after her second divorce in ways that were genuinely specific. She talked about what it cost her, professionally and personally, to be the kind of woman she is in an industry that has very fixed ideas about what kind of woman is worth paying attention to. She talked about love, on screen and off, with an honesty that didn't resolve into any of the expected shapes. She didn't confirm the rumors. She didn't deny them. She did something more useful than either. She explained what it actually looks like to spend a career making audiences feel things that are real and powerful and true while maintaining a private self that belongs only to you. She described the intimacy of film sets, the specific and strange closeness that develops between people who are required to be emotionally open with each other for weeks at a time, without allowing that description to become a confession. She also said something about the cost of that closeness that most people in her position never acknowledge. That doing the work she does, repeatedly, across decades, leaves a residue. Not necessarily the residue the tabloids were always imagining, but something real nonetheless. That the emotional access required to play those roles doesn't just switch off between projects, and that learning to live with that, to contain it without being consumed by it, had been one of the actual challenges of her professional life. That was new information, stated plainly, and it recontextualized everything that had come before it. What she was saying, to anyone listening carefully, was that the question had always been the wrong one. The audience was asking whether the affairs on screen were real. What was actually worth asking was what it takes to make them feel that way. What it costs, what it builds, what it leaves behind in the person who does it across 40 years. That's the story she had always been living. It just wasn't the one anyone had been asking about. The rumors about Diane Lane and her co-stars were never going to get a simple answer because they were never really simple questions. They were the audience's way of asking something it couldn't quite articulate. How does a person contain that much feeling? And where does it all go? She finally answered that, just not in the way anyone expected. Diane Lane spent 4 decades being asked the wrong question about her life, and when she finally answered the right one, most people were too busy looking for the confession to notice. Drop your thoughts below. Do you think audiences will ever stop confusing great acting with personal biography? Or is that just how it works when someone is genuinely that good? If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like and subscribe to our channel. For more interesting stories like this, be sure to click on the next video that pops up on your screen. You never know what you'll discover next.